How many of us can say that we have not seen a doctor for 4 decades? Not many people, I would say. Our guest today, Ian Watson, is one of those people. He discovered homeopathy at the very tender age of just 14 or 15 years old. And the practice of homeopathy and learning about homeopathy has shaped his way of thinking in such a way that he has been able to translate that through all aspects of his life. And so when the pandemic hit and people were going crazy with fear, he was completely calm, and he made the realization that his homeopathic way of thinking is what has actually helped him through all of this. So I absolutely loved our conversation, and I'm hoping that for those of you who are still feeling very anxious about everything that's happening in the world right now, that you'll be able to draw from Ian's conversation and get hope and see how homeopathy is not just a system of medicine, but also a way of thinking and a way of being that can really help us in all aspects of our life. This podcast is obviously a passion project. Every now and again, I think, that's it. I'm not doing this anymore. It takes 3 or 4 hours to edit an episode. There's so many other things I could be doing in my clinic right now, helping clients and actually doing consultations. But then I have somebody like Ian come across my path who just completely brightens up my day, and it just all worth it again. So Ian, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for sharing your knowledge. I hope podcast.
Welcome to the Homeopathy Hangout podcast, where we discuss all things homeopathy from around the world. And now, your host, Eugenie Kruger.
Hello, homies, and a very warm welcome to Homeopathy Hangouts. Today, we have a very special guest, homeopath, educator, and author, Ian Watson, all the way from the UK. Welcome, Ian.
Oh, thank you, Eugenie. It's really nice to be here with you.
Well, it is a dream come true, and I have just had all my fangirl gushing out of the way before we started recording, like I said, so I don't sound like a lunatic, but I am just so excited to have you on today. I have 3 of your books, and after we were talking, I'm absolutely going to get the 4th. And your Guide to Methodologies was actually one of our prescribed textbooks in college. And it's such a wonderful book. I know you've sold thousands of copies of it, and it is a prescribed textbook in many homeopathic colleges across the world. It's a bit of a one of its kind. I don't think there's anything like it on the market, is there?
There probably are others that have been written that are exploring that same topic now, but at the time that I wrote it, there definitely wasn't one. That's why I wrote it. I thought I want to read a book like this. There's a gap here. So.
And you're such a brilliant author. It's such a great read. I just love it. So we are going to be exploring a super interesting topic today, which I can't wait to get into. But before we do, can you tell me a little bit about how you first discovered homeopathy?
Yeah, for sure. I feel like I got lucky because in my teens, I got interested, and I don't really know how or why I got interested. It wasn't in my family or anything like that, but I got interested in all forms of alternative healing. And particularly at that time, herbal medicines. And, I started getting interested in the fact that I spent a lot of time in nature, and I was interested in the fact that a lot of the trees and plants that were just growing around where I lived were actually medicines. That somehow fascinated me, that whole idea. And then one day I came across a book in one of those remainder bookshops where they sell off the books that they can't sell. And it was like an A to Z of alternative therapies. I remember buying this book and just reading it cover to cover and, really fascinated by it. I was about 14 or 15. And somewhere in the middle was homeopathy. And I remember that's the one that really caught my attention. There was something about this, the fact that it had been here around for so long, and also that it was a European, it was a Western form of medicine. It hadn't come from the East or something like that, like acupuncture had. And yet nobody knew anything about it. It was relatively unknown, and I didn't even know if anybody practiced it anymore. But I was just fascinated by that. And that was my kind of wake up to homeopathy. And then I just started buying more books and studying it. And then someone gifted me a kit, which they'd had in the family for years. And I started using the remedies, and lo and behold, they worked. And then some years later, I discovered that there was a college and you could still train in this damn thing.
Wow. You were so young.
Yeah, but I imagined it had kind of gone out of fashion 100 years ago, because all the books I got were written 100 years earlier, So I did start young, and I was only 20 then when I started my studies. I was like the youngest person in the group. Most people were coming to it later in life. And so that's why I feel I really got lucky, and that set me on my path.
Mm-hmm. I just want to add a quick question in there. What was it like for you practicing as such a young person? Because we've got a few mums here in Perth who are about to start their homeopathic journey, because you couldn't study homeopathy in Australia for a couple of years. We now have a college again. And I just, as a young person, what was that like?
I just loved it. It was the best time of my life. And
amazing.
I think it gave me an advantage because I didn't seem to have a lot of the worries and fears that I noticed some of my peers, and colleagues had. I just didn't seem to take any of that on. I was just dying to get going with the practice. I was practicing before I even went to college.
Wow. So you were rearing to go.
I was just raring to go because I couldn't deny my own experience. I'd already been using homeopathy for a number of years on humans and animals and seeing great results. And when it didn't work, just nothing happened. So that one didn't seem like a big deal to me. I just didn't worry about it. And I had a very kind of open approach to it. And I had good teachers as well who were very encouraging. They were basically like, yeah, go for it.
Amazing.
Yeah, it wasn't a disadvantage being young. I think I felt like it gave me an advantage.
I'm really glad to hear that, because we've got a couple of young girls on reception, 19 and 20-year-old, and I've been encouraging them to get into homeopathy. So that's really great to hear. Now we have a nice meaty topic that we're going to get into today, which I haven't really seen this talked about anywhere else except for you, but you have obviously lots of other practices that you draw on alongside the homeopathy. And it is how you were saying how the principles of homeopathy can really be used as sort of principles for life. And I was just telling you before we started recording that I listened to an interview that you did 22 years ago. And you were saying that one day you're going to write this book because you're entertaining this idea of how the principles of homeopathy can actually be seen as principles for life. So I am just excited to hear, how you came up with this concept and what you would like to tell our listeners around this.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the reason I mentioned that as a possible topic, because it was kind of fresh in my mind relatively. And that arose as a result of the country going into lockdown, which I know your country did too. February, March, I think it was 2019, was it? I can't remember.
Yes, same.
2 years ago, my God. And I remember a lot of people, getting freaked out by that and losing their heads. And I also remember noticing that I really wasn't that concerned. It didn't look to me like something we should be panicking over. First of all, because we have homeopathy, we know the remedies have worked for 200 years. With all kinds of epidemics. And, to me, it was just like, look, this is a good time for the homeopaths to get busy. We know how to respond to these things. But what floated into my mind was a kind of recollection that I hadn't seen a doctor for 43 years at that point. It was 1977, the last time I saw a doctor. I remember it well. And then associated with that came the thought, the memory that, well, I started studying homeopathy about that time, by myself. That's when I started buying books and really getting into it when I was about 16. I thought, well, those two things are connected. Homeopathy has helped me to stay healthy. And it's not to say I've never been ill. Of course, I've been sick, but I learned how to navigate through health challenges with the help of homeopathy. And then I started to reflect on it. And I realized it's not just the fact that I learned remedies. It's the fact that homeopathy opened me to this way of looking at life and health and disease and healing and all of that in a really deep way. And I think a lot of that is unconscious. When you're learning homeopathy, it's just kind of seeping into you somehow. And you don't realize it's changing your worldview until you do.
Absolutely.
Usually when you run into a friend who you haven't seen for a while and you realize, I'm actually speaking from a different place now. I've got a different understanding of how all this works. So I just had this tremendous sense of gratitude to homeopathy for kind of opening that window for me. And when I reflected back on it, I thought, well, those things that I learned early on in my homeopathic studies, they're still as relevant today and as helpful today. And I think that's why homeopathy endures despite all efforts to get rid of it and, eradicate it and so on. To me, homeopathy endures because it's built on truth. There's something that's fundamentally true that is the foundation of homeopathy. And in a sense, you can't argue with that. You can try, and you can make it difficult for people to practice based on it. But the truth of it remains, and it will inevitably reassert itself because that's just what happens in nature. What's true is true. It doesn't go away just because someone disagrees with it. And what I mean by that is, just as a starting point, if you think about the basic principle of homeopathy, we know is law of similars, principle of similars, let's call it that. The idea being that any substance that can produce symptoms in a healthy person is capable of curing similar symptoms in someone who's sick. Hahnemann recognizing that in late 1700s, whenever it was, that was like to me, that was the Newton's apple moment of homeopathy,
Yeah.
Can you imagine the kind of insight that he must have had? It's like, oh my God, this is why this, cinchona bark can cure malarial fevers. He dosed himself with it and discovered it's creating the same symptoms. Now, his next thought, because he was scientific, his next thought was probably, it could be a coincidence, right? It could just be coincidental that this substance produces similar symptoms to the one it cures. So what does he do? Well, let's try some other substances that have a curative reputation, some of the herbal things that are known to be curative. Let's try them and see. So he tested those. And you know what? They all seem to conform to the same principle. That must have been the mind blower for him. I can only imagine how exciting that must have been. Because what's happened there, he's uncovered a hidden principle in nature, which was always there. And it's popped up from time to time. He found reference to it in the ancient Greek writings, Hippocrates and so on. He found examples where one disease had seemed to eliminate a similar disease in the same person. So he'd seen all these examples in medical history, but no one had really uncovered it as a principle and found a way to systematically turn that into a system of healing. That was down to Hahnemann's genius. So to me, that's the first thing that I would point to, is that homeopathy has this foundation which is really solid. And that idea that there's something in nature which is benevolent, like the intelligence behind life, whatever we call that. If you're religious, you call that God, but you don't have to be religious to acknowledge that there's an intelligence that's behind life, that something is doing it. We're not. You put an acorn in the ground, it turns into an oak tree. It's not random. There's some miraculous intelligence that knows how to grow stuff. It knows how to heal bodies and replicate cells and all of this. That intelligence also has built into it the knowledge of how to heal. And it's something that we can participate in that process by learning. And that to me is fascinating, that homeopathy requires we have to engage with the process. Provings have to happen. People have to test the medicines to make it conscious. Whatever it is that, the healing power that's hidden in the substance has to be brought out into the open. But once that's been done, everyone can benefit from that information forever. It becomes something that's part of the collective homeopathic pool of knowledge, which is just amazing. So none of the things that that Hahnemann discovered ever became obsolete or irrelevant. We're still using the same down remedies that he said were effective 200 years ago. We just keep adding and discovering new uses for them. So that to me would be an example of what I mean by, when I started reflecting on this thing, it's like, that's amazing that Hahnemann, he discovered something that's hidden in nature. So that was the first thing that kind of got me excited, was that I think the principle of homeopathy, principle of similars, points to the fact that there's an intelligence in nature and that there's also a benevolence in nature. We've been gifted with the ability to find a remedy for any kind of ailment that humans and even non-humans can suffer from, if we're willing to do the work. We have to participate and do some work to uncover that knowledge, but it's available to us. And Hahnemann's shown us the map for how we can navigate that territory. So then you think, well, what's the next kind of foundational piece of homeopathy? And in no particular order, similars is number one. That's the base, basically. Then the next thing that Hahnemann developed, what he was up against was, well, some of these medicines are fantastic as curative, arsenic, mercury, belladonna, but they're also deadly poisons. So this is problematic, because how do you find the dose that can cure the person without killing or poisoning them in the process? Now, that happens to be the same problem that plagues pharmaceutical industry to this day.
Yeah.
They haven't figured that one out.
No.
Right? Now, imagine this. Hahnemann solved that problem 200 years ago. He solved it for everyone for all time. How? By introducing the idea of potentization. that we can take the original substance, and if we dilute it, but not just dilute it, we dilute it and we also increase the energy of it by what he called succussion, which is shaking with an impact. If we include that component, then you can dilute to a point where it's no longer harmful. It's perfectly safe. You can give it to a baby. It's no big deal. And yet something of the signature of the substance has been remained and even amplified so that its medicinal capability is still there. Now, how is that possible? And this is the big stumbling block for materially minded people, isn't it? You know, homeopathy must be nonsense because you dilute it so much, there's nothing in it. Materially, that's what they say. Well, we know that those remedies work just fine. You know, homeopathy doesn't seem to care that it shouldn't work, you know. Like the bees, you know, they're not supposed to be able to fly, right, with those tiny little wings.
I say with gravity as well, just because we don't understand it doesn't mean we're flying off the face of the earth. Gravity doesn't seem to mind. It still keeps us on the planet.
Exactly. So one of the things that to me is fascinating about that is that what the doorway that Hahnemann opened there was that we have to consider life energetically and not materialistically. And that's important because homeopathy doesn't make sense as long as you stay in a materialistic mindset. That's why a lot of people just can't grasp it. And they, you know, even if they try and get their heads around it, at a certain point, this just doesn't make sense. You've diluted beyond the point there's any molecules left of the original substance. This cannot work. But as soon as you drop a materialistic approach to life, and let's face it, physics dropped it in the early 1900s, right? When physics got to a certain point of investigating matter, and we went into what's called the quantum physics era, what did they discover? Vast amounts of empty space with the appearance of waves and particles. They said, like, they're not actually particles. It's an appearance which are in such high velocity motion that it creates the illusion of solidity. I mean, that's the basic conclusion that the physicists came to over 100 years ago. There's nothing there. It's not solid. It's energy vibrating at high frequency, which creates the illusion of permanence and solidity. So what's medicine playing at? It's 100 years behind the basic understanding of physics, still adhering to the idea that it's all just biological and chemical. This is an outmoded idea. And Hahnemann just happened to be 100 years ahead of his time, at least, because he realized that, he embraced that already, that disease and cure take place on what he called the dynamic plane, which is just another way of talking about that there's an energy system that's at work that is part and parcel of what we're witnessing and experiencing in terms of our physiology. And the whole thing is energetic. The whole universe is energy. It's just showing up in different forms. Now, as soon as you open your mind to that possibility, homeopathy makes perfect sense.
It really does.
Right? As does acupuncture, as does shiatsu, and all these other things that have been based on that same understanding. But if you don't make that shift in your consciousness, then homeopathy becomes like a stumbling block. It just becomes like an anomaly, you know, and it has to be something that you have to demonize now because it's like the fly in the ointment.
Yeah.
So to me, it's important that people recognize that this is part of what homeopathy is up against, but it's also part of what homeopathy offers. It offers this like a bridge from the material world to the non-material. Because we start with material substance, but then we potentize it and we take it to a place where it's not material. And that, to me, leads into a conversation around susceptibility, which is another key thing that I learned in my homeopathic training, was the fact that, and I can't believe that I didn't see this until it was pointed out to me, the fact that when there's an epidemic, let's say, does everybody get sick with the same thing? Turns out they don't. Even the most raging epidemics, there's a whole bunch of people who were just unaffected by it. Well, how does that work? First of all, you know, if this disease agent is supposedly so pathogenic and so virulent, you know, and it's out to kill us, how come there's a whole bunch of the population are just unaffected by it? Or worse, they get a minor cold, you know, like symptoms, something like this. So that's one aspect of susceptibility, is that if we're not receptive to whatever seems to be going around at a particular time, we don't get sick. It doesn't have that power to make us sick in and of itself. We have to participate in the getting sick process. So that was an eye opener for me. It was like, oh yeah, that's kind of obvious when you think about it, right? It's never the case that everybody gets sick with the same thing at the same time. And then you look at the other side of that. What I realized was that homeopaths are utilizing susceptibility in a positive way. That's how we can get away with using these super dilute substances. We're giving a medicine that has to match vibrationally. It has to be a match, which is why we have to take a detailed case. We have to get symptom similarity, has to be lined up. If that's the case, if we've done our work properly, that person is super susceptible to that remedy, not to remedies generally, but to that one. So we can give it to anybody else and nothing happens. You give one dose of it to that person and like, whoa.
I've never thought of susceptibility that way, but yes, absolutely. We are using that to our advantage. I've always just thought about it the first way, not the second. Yeah.
I know, right? It blew my mind when I saw that. I was like, oh, wow, it's actually an important piece of understanding how homeopathy works.
Yeah.
As an energy medicine. And not just homeopathy, but how all energy medicines work, right? How can an acupuncturist stick a needle in some point on the finger and have an effect on the liver? It's the same idea, right? Again, it has to match. It has to match it has to have a resonant frequency with where the person is in that particular moment. And if it doesn't, it's just, you just score a miss. Nothing happens. So to me, that's another piece of the puzzle. And in homeopathy, we talk about the minimum dose as being an important aspect of it. We give the least that is needed to bring about a curative response, and we try not to do any more than that. Well, why? Well, one reason is what I've just described. The least is enough. If you're utilizing susceptibility, you don't need much. Which anybody with a severe allergy knows that.
Only a tiny little bit of pollen or a tiny little bit of grass or a little lick from a dog.
Exactly. Or peanut allergy, that kind of thing.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Some people now, this is a, potentially life-threatening situation. And yet for most people, peanuts is food. It's right. Well, what's the variable? The variable is the susceptibility. It's got nothing to do with the nuts per se. And it's the same with homeopathy. And that's why there's no such thing as a standardized treatment in homeopathy. Susceptibility is the key to understanding that. Like why we have to individualize. If we don't individualize the remedies so that it's a good match to the symptom picture of the person, homeopathy can't work. It can't work because susceptibility will not be engaged. We're missing somehow. So that's an important piece. But I think the other thing about minimum dose is that it points to the fact that nature is what's doing the healing, not the medicine. So that's the other thing that I think homeopathy helped me to see. And again, it's easy to mistakenly think when you give a remedy or you take a remedy and you see a dramatic healing response, it's very easy and tempting to attribute the healing response to the medicine.
Yeah.
Right. It looks like that's what did it. And okay, we should certainly give the remedies some credit. I mean, it's great that if we didn't have them, we wouldn't be able to bring about these fantastic results. But I think it's important that we have to understand the remedies acting purely as a catalyst. So when we're utilizing susceptibility accurately, the remedy is a good match. It catalyzes the self-healing response from within the person. And again, that to me ties in with the first point. The intelligence in nature is such that self-healing is built into the system. It's built into life. We don't have to know how to do that. And we don't know how to do that. If you cut yourself and you just dress the wound and basically leave it, you could just sit and watch a miracle of healing happening. But it doesn't matter how much willpower you use, you won't make it go any faster. It goes exactly at its own pace, and it knows what it's doing, and it knows when it's the time to granulate over that wound and form some scar tissue. And all of that is just taken care of by itself. It's miraculous. So that, again, it's built into life. The self-healing tendency is built into life. So I think that's really good for us to know because it humbles us. It keeps us humble. So we can never get too carried away taking the credit. Look how clever we are with our remedies. Yeah. It's like, no, I mean, yeah, you've got to have a certain level of skill, but you've also got to stay humble and recognize we're not doing the healing ever. Yeah, it's built into nature. And the best that we can ever hope to do is to find a way to catalyze that.
And that's
So
also
that
really important for our clients and our patients to know. And I know I've read you say this, and it's something I always say as well, is we all have everything in us right this second to heal. You don't need anything external. It's all inside you right now. And you're so right. And so it's important for our clients or our patients to know this as well, because they, part of the healing process. This is their unique healing process. We are not the gurus.
That's right. I think you're absolutely right. To me, it gets us in right relationship to the homeopathy as a therapy and also into the treatment, so that it doesn't become like a dependency relationship on the practitioner or on the treatment. Yeah, we're getting in right relationship with it. We're recognizing that it has a good role to play, but we're also taking full responsibility for our own self-healing capacity and recognizing that part is within us, and no one else can give that to us. No one else can take it away from us either. That's how it should be, it seems to me. That is part of the design. And there's one other piece that I'll just mention, and then we'll see what questions occur to you. And the other one would be around the term cure. Again, it was a mind blower for me when I learned in homeopathy this thing called direction of cure, that there is actually a way that you can understand whether someone's getting well or whether they're not. And particularly in the context of chronic disease, but also in acute disease, it still applies. But there's a kind of template, there's a map that's been laid out by homeopaths of, times past. Constantine Herring, I think, was the main one who kind of elucidated this and came up with this term direction of cure. And to me, the amazing thing about that is that it doesn't just apply to homeopathy. You can use that as a template, and you can apply it to any system of healing, and or any kind of treatment. And you can look through that lens of direction of cure, and it will tell you accurately and unerringly whether this treatment is actually helping that person to heal or not. That's really powerful to me. Modern medicine doesn't have anything like that in its toolkit. And that's a big problem for modern medicine. So what it illuminates, partly, I'll just mention this briefly, is it illuminates the distinction between cure, what homeopaths call cure, and what we call palliation, and what we call suppression. And that, again, I didn't learn that outside of homeopathy. That was one of the gifts that homeopathy gave me. My understanding was like, oh, cure is not just one thing. It's not quite so straightforward. You can actually break it down and understand it in a deeper way. So what is cure? Cure is restoration of health. That's what cure is. It's where the person undergoes some kind of treatment journey, some kind of healing process. When they come out the other side, their health is restored. They might even be healthier and stronger than they were when they started. But, the minimum is that their health is restored. So they're not left with anything as a leftover, and they haven't been given some new disease that they didn't have before.
Yeah.
That's not cure. So then we got the second term, palliation. Well, what's that? Palliation is you get some symptom relief as long as you keep taking the treatment. And as soon as you stop the treatment, the symptom, the disease comes back just as bad as it was before. Well, what's that? That's most of modern medicine.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. If you look at it honestly, and just, with that knowledge in mind, most drugs are designed to do exactly that. They're not designed to cure. They don't restore a person to health. The deal is you keep taking this pretty much forever and you'll get some relief. And if you stop taking it, you're going to suffer again. So in our mind, from a homeopathic standpoint, we can look at that treatment and say, well, it might be helping you to manage your life and your symptoms, but it's not curing you. We can do better than that. Would you be interested?
Yeah. And then suppression is probably the scariest of all.
Yeah. Well, then there's a third category, which is suppression, which again, I learned about only through homeopathy, which is that there are some treatment protocols where all that's happening is that the symptoms are being made to go away forcefully. So we're imposing something on the body system or the body mind. We're making the symptoms disappear and effectively having them be replaced by something else that's worse. So the intelligence behind our mind body is doing its best to maintain health. When there's a certain point when it gets really bombarded with whatever treatment it gets bombarded with, at a certain point it gives in and says, I can't maintain this anymore. Some new disease process gets started off that wasn't there before. It's a direct result. It's called iatrogenic illness. It's a direct result of the treatment. Now, you will not see that in homeopathy. You'll see a lot of that in orthodox Western medicine.
Mm-hmm.
It's in some senses it's brutal medicine. It's heavy-handed, and again, that there's no context for that within Western medicine. There isn't that understanding that. I mean, of course, they talk about side effects and so on, but they don't have a deep enough understanding to realize that you're actually inducing diseases that are worse than the thing the person started with.
Mm.
And again, we can do better than that.
Mm-hmm.
If we understand how healing really works, we don't have to subject people to these kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
So those are my thoughts on that, Eugenie. They're just some of the things that have kind of popped into my mind since we agreed to have this chat.
I love it. And so knowing these principles of homeopathy, you feel that was one of the things that managed to help you stay calm throughout the pandemic? Because where you guys are, it sounds like you don't have masks and mandates or anything like that at the moment, but things are just really kicking in here for us in Australia. And we have so many mandates over here. Everyone's wearing masks everywhere. So it feels to me that we are just like kind of started to kick into gear over here. And the anxiety is very high for a lot of people over here. Have you got any advice for people listening to this podcast that just feel really anxious and really worried? And the other thing is that our borders here in WA in Western Australia has been closed the whole time. And some people are terrified of it opening. So have you got some advice? Like what? And I know, and you're welcome to draw on other principles as well, because I know you use a lot of other principles and practices outside of homeopathy. But what advice do you have for our listeners to help them stay calm?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think really, to me, that is the real pandemic is a pandemic of fear.
Well said.
I would say that's the main thing that we're up against, right? Which is interesting because the word pan has got the same root as the word panic.
Oh, yes.
Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, I was thinking, is that intentional?
Well, that's where pandemic comes from. The idea, originally it was something that induced panic in people because it's like, when the plague breaks out, what happens? People freak out. So it's understandable that people would be scared. But I think also there has been a lot of fear programming has been put into us. But again, think about this, what we just said about susceptibility. That programming can only affect you if you're susceptible to it. And that's what I was so grateful for through my homeopathic understanding. I noticed a lot of people were getting really terrified. I also noticed I wasn't. Right? And that means that that's a susceptibility issue. So there was something in what I'd come to see about health and disease that settled me down and enabled me to kind of look at it a bit more calmly and to say, well, okay, yes, some people are getting sick, but people have always gotten sick around winter time. That's not so unusual. And maybe this is a bit different to what we've experienced before, but it doesn't seem to warrant the kind of response. So I think that's the first thing, is just to get it in perspective. But the other thing that I've come to see is that our feelings are created inside of us through the power of thought. So it can look like something out there is what's frightening us, what's freaking us out. That's not really true. That's an illusion. That's why you can have the same thing happening out there and 9 people are freaking out, but there's always going to be one person who's like, yeah, whatever. Well, what's the variable?
Yeah.
The variable is what's happening in your own mind. So I think, to me, part of this pandemic of fear, it's an invitation for us to really take a look at that and to see to what extent are we freaking ourselves out. And it turns out that's mostly what we're up against. We're getting caught in something. And then it's when we look at anything through the lens of fear and panic, it looks scary and terrifying. And it looks like we need to do drastic things to make it go away and to keep ourselves safe. It looks, that's normal. That's natural that we would think that way. If any of us get really freaked out, we think our life's in danger, we'll do drastic things that we wouldn't consider under normal circumstance. So to me, it is a kind of an inside job for each of us. We have to come back to a place of common sense and recognize that actually we're still okay on the inside, and that we don't have to wait for the world to change to come back to a place of okayness. And when we find that place of okayness, then we can actually participate in changing the world in a positive way. Then we can start to stand up and say, you know what? We're not putting up with this nonsense anymore.
Absolutely.
And I think that is what's happening in different countries now. We're all just at different kind of stages of the same process. So the other thing I would say is just be patient, for people. It's like, there's a certain endurance test going on here. We've got to kind of sit it out. But this thing won't last forever. And these measures won't last forever because they're built on a false foundation. And they're only kept in place because of the fact that a lot of people have been terrified and made to feel very frightened. That won't endure forever. That's going to pass. And there's a deeper truth which is emerging now. And once we get in touch with that, we start to regain our common sense and our sense of solid ground. We know there's something in us that we can trust in. And I think once people start to recognize that they haven't lost that, you can't lose it. It just gets obscured temporarily. You come back to what you know in your own heart has been true, then you can trust that. We've always trusted in that. It's seen us through all kinds of difficulties before, and it will see us through this.
I heard the most beautiful saying the other day. It said, an ocean of water cannot sink a ship if it cannot find a way in. And I don't know, that was really enlightening for me, because I was like, yeah, that boat is on there, and it can't sink because it doesn't have a hole in it. But the second the water comes in, that's it. So it's only if we allow the water in that it can drown us. But
that's susceptibility right there, isn't it?
It is. It really is. I have a little bit of a homeopath question for you, because the podcast is mostly for the general public, but we do have homeopaths that listen as well. I know lots of homeopaths go through this. Now, it sometimes feels like you can know nothing, even though I've been practicing for 10 years and studied for 4 years full time. I find I get to a point every year or so where I just feel like I know nothing. Because we have so many new books, so many new remedies. We have over 8,000 remedies now. There's so many new prescribing techniques. And just wanted to see if you have some wisdom maybe for the homeopaths out there who feel that sometimes it gets a little bit all overwhelming, because so many homeopaths stop their practice at one stage because it all feels a little bit too much. Have you got any advice?
Yeah, and I've seen exactly that same thing that you're describing. There's a couple of things I would say to that. I mean, the first one is that I think it's actually appropriate and true that we recognize we don't really know anything.
That's true. Keeps you humble.
It keeps us humble, and I don't think that's a bad thing at all. And there is a truth in that, because relative to what could be known, we don't know anything. I mean, what's 8,000 remedies in the scheme of things?
Yeah.
There's hundreds of thousands of just plants. We don't even get started on the animal kingdom and the vegetable kingdom and all of that. So that's always going to be the case, that we're only utilizing a very small percentage of all the possible medicinal agents that there are in the world. So at some point, we just got to acknowledge that. That's part of the deal, is that we got to live with the fact that we're always going to know just 1%. But I think the other side of it to me is, I remember the fact, and I read a lot of the early homeopaths' work, and to me, it's helpful to remember that they were bringing about curative results in cases that oftentimes were more extreme than the things that we're seeing today. And what did they have? 45 remedies to play with.
That's true.
Right? And they knew them so well and so intimately, and they weren't concerned with just finding the one remedy that did everything. They'd find one remedy that would do 25%, and then another one that would do the next 50%, and then the third one that would do the remaining 25%. They were very content with that, like zigzagging towards a curative response. And when I read these stories, I thought, well, you know what? I'm just going to emulate those. I'm going to chiefly stick with the remedies I know and get to know them like my best friends, and use them in most cases. Because when you really get to know them, you can trust them. You can trust the ones that you know well, like your friends, right?
They really are.
If you really know them, really inside out, that automatically brings trust over time. And then occasionally, when maybe you find yourself in a situation where they're not quite doing everything that is needed, then you go outside of your familiar group and you add to your knowledge. But I think a lot of homeopaths have gotten carried away by all the new stuff, and it's tempting. Shiny new things.
It is. I have got FOMO, fear of missing out, because it just feels like there's so many toys to play with, and I want to play with them all.
Well, I think that's okay, but we should recognize that that's all it is. We're just playing.
Yes.
Right. And all of this, a lot of this new remedies and stuff, it's to entertain the homeopaths. It's not for the patients. Right. I think we kid ourselves that these are the remedies that are needed for these times. Well, maybe, yes, some of them, maybe a handful, but actually the old remedies still work beautifully as well.
They do. They really do.
right? And we can easily lose sight of that. I mean, I've treated friends and family with COVID diagnosis and so on. I haven't used any remedy that you won't find in a 35 remedy kit.
Beautiful.
And they've all gotten better. Every single one. And it's been gelsemium, bryonia, arnica, sometimes sulfur to clear up that, it's been regular remedies. Any first-year homeopath could have found these remedies. It wasn't that complicated. And people are like freaking, maybe we need some special new remedy because it's a weird virus. It's like, just look at the case. Mostly you don't. It's quite straightforward. So I think, feel free to follow your interest in these new directions, but just know also that the remedies that have stood the test of time, there's a reason why they've stood the test of time.
Your old friends are always there for you when you're ready for them.
Exactly. Well, I'm a bit old school now, and that's coming across, and I hold my hand up. So there's a whole bunch of remedies that I've never even heard of. I don't even know what they are. But I don't feel like that, to me, doesn't feel like a lack, because I know that I can do good work with what I do know.
Beautiful. Oh, Ian, it's been so amazing chatting with you. Can you please let our listeners know how they can get hold of you and the work that you do?
Oh, sure. Yeah, thank you for this opportunity. It's just nice to have these conversations. And I think if it's interesting and helpful for other people, that's a bonus. My website is called theinsightspace.com. So it's all written as one word, theinsightspace.com. And that's where people can find, I've got a lot of resources on there, audio and video things, articles and so on, and links to my upcoming workshops and what have you. And I don't do so much individual homeopathic. I don't do any professional homeopathic practice anymore, but I'm still involved in the education side, and I support practitioners as best I can with the work that I do. And a lot of the work that I seem to be drawn towards is helping people get out of their own way, basically. And that includes the homeopaths, because homeopaths are
especially the homeopaths. Yeah, we're good at getting in our own way.
As anybody, I think.
Absolutely.
So, I used to run a homeopathic training school for about 10 years, and I saw how people can get really caught up in their own anxieties and fears and worries. And then homeopathy starts looking and feeling really difficult and complicated. And it's not. In its essence, it's really simple and straightforward. And the only thing that complicates it is the human mind. So that's mostly my work, is helping people to simplify and to reconnect with that original enthusiasm and passion that they had for their work. Because when you have that carries you a long way. And, you don't want to get bogged down and fearful about it. You want to do it from that place of love and passion. Then you'll do your best work. Absolutely. So that's what I like to do.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And please write some more books.
Thank you. I'll do my best.
Thank you for your time.